Thank you for being here. I want to talk to you about where we are at this moment in reality. This is going to be a conversation of enormous crisis, well-researched, documented in decades of my work, the work of others, and the work that we're doing at the Unique Self Institute. But this is also going to be a conversation of radical positivity, of incredible optimism and hope and possibility. Because crisis is an evolutionary driver. Our crisis itself is a birth. We live in a time between worlds. It's a time unlike any other. It's not only a time between worlds where the old systems and the old structures that have in different ways governed reality for the past 100, 500,000, and ultimately the same basic principles for the past 10,000 years are all breaking down. But the new world hasn't yet emerged, and the nature of the breakdown is such that there's very serious possibility, based on the best research, the best analysis, the best mathematics, the best social investigation, there's very real possibility that actually there won't be a future, that actually the next world won't emerge. So we're living at this time between worlds. We're living at this time between stories. The old stories are breaking down of what it means to be a human, about what value means, about what desire means, about our relationship to our power. We don't have a new story equal to our new powers. We have the powers of ancient gods, and yet we have no wisdom that guides them. There's this huge gap between our exterior technologies exploding at exponential rates, creating extraction models from planet Earth. We extract in a few decades what it took us billions of years to create. We move from 4 billion to 8 billion people, creating a system that is liable, based on all that we know about growth curves, to self-terminate, to end itself. And at the core is this gap between what we might call these exterior technologies, filled with promise and filled with peril. Because technology is neither a great promise nor a great peril. Technology needs to be rooted in a larger story. So we're driven by these technologies filled with promise and peril, exterior technologies, but our interior technologies, our structures of value, our stories about ourselves and about cosmos, about our nature, about the nature of reality, have broken down, debilitated, and degraded. So we're moving towards a world of upgraded algorithms, downgraded human beings, with exponential technologies that are set to destroy, to implode the entire system. And yet, we're not just poised before a potential dystopia, we also have the capacity to access new interior technologies, to redirect the exterior technologies, to close the gap between interiors and exteriors, and to create a utopia, to create a vision of reality, of goodness, of truth, of beauty. The possibility of an unimaginable goodness, truth, and beauty lies before us. So we're at a time between worlds. We're at a time between stories. We're poised between utopia and dystopia, quite literally. And I want to understand this with you for a second. This is not meta-theoretical. Imagine for a second, if you want to catch the image, the greatest story told in public human history in the last 50 years took place in the cinema. It was called and is called, it's ongoing, Star Wars. And at the center of the first Star Wars trilogy, movies 4, 5, and 6, if you track those things, is a battleship built by the forces of ostensible order, who are totalitarian, called the Death Star. And the Death Star is a unique battleship because it has the capacity to literally destroy a planet. That's what we're calling existential risk. Existential risk, which is a new reality, means that we've generated the structures in culture that will end culture itself. That humanity has generated the possibility of its own death. And that possibility is not meta-theoretical. It's a genuine possibility in this lifetime. There's a more significant chance that that will happen than that you'll be killed in a car accident. We worry about car accidents, we ignore existential risk. And as the timeline moves, the possibility becomes greater and greater that we will actually end life and human life on this planet. Now, I want to get with you what that means, because it's hard to access, right? It's hard to think about 10 years from now, let alone the future. It's hard to care about who I'll be when I'm making decisions now in 10 years from now. Hard to care about what's happening to children in Yemen until we see a picture of a 10-year-old girl from Yemen, and then she becomes alive for us. But we have no pictures from the future. We have no news feed from the future. But actually, there are trillions of unborn men, women, and children. And the voices of the unborn call to us. Trillions of love stories, trillions of acts of creativity and kindness and goodness and depth and value. All of that, according to our best understandings today, at the leading edges of insight and contemporary political understanding, which barely scratches the surface of the public because the public structure is driven by a complete obsession with a kind of short-termism, right? A short-term relationship to life. We don't know how to think about the future, which is why we ignore the future. Now, just to feel into this for a second, it means that all the future people have no voice and they have no vote except for us. Let's go deeper. Existential risk means not only no future, it means the destruction as we know it of the present. And there's two forms of existential risk. There's what I would call the death of humanity itself. And then there's a second form, which I might call the death of our humanity. That's a vision of a techno-feudalist, technocratic lockdown in reality, a kind of freezing of reality inside the structure, not of an open society, think vibrant pluralistic democracy, but inside of a closed society, which is governed by an algorithmic power driven by machine intelligence, which is the immersive system in which everyone lives. Now, of course, that's not a dystopian future. We're just about there, where your number, your identity is completely tied in to the technocratic structure of the web. We're creating what's virtually a global surveillance system without any sense of deep value structures to guide that, in which, again, human beings become downgraded and downgraded and downgraded, and algorithms get upgraded and upgraded and upgraded in any genuine sense of free will, any genuine sense of human creativity, any genuine sense of Eros is crushed by the technocratic system. Often, it's science fiction that captures this first, and it's been capturing it for at least 100 years. But if you want just one image of a dystopian society, the death of our humanity, think Blade Runner, or think more recently, Hunger Games. It's right there. And the best research we have, and if you actually follow what's happening, says that it's not just a possibility, but it's actually where we're going. It's where the very structure of the system is going. So we're moving in two directions: to the death of humanity, the potential death of humanity as a significant statistical possibility, even probability, over longer stretches of time. A. B, towards the death of our humanity. Now, it doesn't really matter whether, as many think, this could be a potential reality in 35 to 45 or 50 years, or it's going to take 100 years, or it's going to take 125 years. Its very existence changes who we are. Just imagine for a second. I'll do a thought experiment with you. What if you knew that in 150 years from now, there's no future? So nothing changes for you. You could live out your entire life the same way that you live it right now, and if you have children, your children as well. But you know that in 150 years, it's over. Does that affect the way you live today? Does that affect your experience of reality? Think about it. Of course it does. All of a sudden, there's something that doesn't make sense. There's a kind of emptiness, right? The vitality, right? The Eros, the very meaningfulness, the value of life is somehow emptied, even though there's no direct effect on your life or your children's or your grandchildren's for the next 150 years. Imagine we got a note from a set of space aliens that said, we're going to conquer and destroy planet Earth in 150 years. We were able to validate the note, or we're going to conquer and completely dominate humanity in 150 years. We validated that note. It's 100% true. So what would we do? We would do everything in our power to prevent that. And what we're doing is we're literally burying our heads and hearts in the sand. We're not taking our seat at the table of history. We're ignoring both existential and catastrophic risk. You know, in bridge building, there's what's called the problem of the falling bridge. Can you imagine engineers building bridges ignoring the problem of the falling bridge? No, problem of the falling bridge, that's a separate issue. Let's not deal with that. It's insanity. So we've enacted a society ignoring the problem of the falling bridge, and we're headed quite rapidly, very possibly within our own lifetimes, and again, statistically, significantly more real chance that that will happen than you'll get killed in a car accident. Imagine if there was a huge spike in car accidents. All of a sudden you get worried. Well, actually, this is a big spike, right, in the potential of the death of humanity and the death of our humanity. But here's the great news. we have the absolute capacity to change it. The future actually is in our hands. We actually can access a memory of a different future. And hope is a memory of a different future. Let's go back to the Death Star for a second. In that Death Star image, in that classical story of Star Wars, the rebels, those people who are thinking about existential risk and catastrophic risk, they don't actually have the capacity to take out the Death Star. And the Death Star is not just a planet-destroying battleship that deals death to planets, right? It's not just a ship. It's an archetype. It's a culture of death. It's a culture of existential risk. It's a culture of catastrophic risk. Now, if you remember the story, and often culture speaks unconsciously, intuitively, through its public stories with a wisdom that far exceeds the particular script writers. And in that story, the way you take down the Death Star is you score a direct hit. And a direct hit was undefended, right, by those who developed the Death Star. They created all these structures, technocratic, social, economic, political, but they didn't account for the possibility of what they call in the cinematic tale a direct hit. If you score a direct hit, you can take down the Death Star, you can actually change the very vector of civilization. You can undo, you can unhook the train careening towards existential and catastrophic risk. You can take down the culture of death and enact a new possibility in its place. So what does it mean to score a direct hit? What is that direct hit that can actually step into the Death Star culture, which is generating existential and catastrophic risk, and change our destiny? So in fact, there's going to be a future. So in fact, there will be a future. So there will be humanity, and not only humanity, but a flourishing humanity, right? A thriving humanity, a humanity that's good, true, and beautiful, that ushers in a potential world, right, of human dignity and human wonder, right, and human beauty and human depth and human unique creativity, unimaginable in previous human history. This is the moment we're at, my friends. We can look away, but if we look away, we've lost our hearts. We've lost our souls. We stand at this moment in a time between worlds, in a time between stories. We stand poised between utopia and dystopia. And yet, we're not filled with despair. We're filled with hope. Hope is this memory of the future. There's a direct hit, and that direct hit can actually be enacted by us. What I'd like to talk to you about in this conversation is, what is that direct hit? The Death Star is, in the story, a battleship of the Republic, and the Republic is the force of totalitarian control, and the Death Star is armed with a death-dealing capacity. The Death Star has the capacity to destroy an entire planet. In other words, the Death Star poses existential risk to the existence, the very existence of the planet. The only way to engage the Death Star, those in the movie, the rebels, who are in effect those who are concerned with, have placed their attention on, are aware of existential risk. They're aware of the Death Star. They realize the Death Star poses an existential risk, can destroy the planet. They realize they can't take it on directly. And the Death Star, remember, is not simply a planet-destroying battlestar weapon. In the mythology of Star Wars, which is culture speaking to itself, the Death Star is culture itself. It's the culture that's generated existential risk. It's the culture whose systemic structures have generated existential risk. And there's this understanding that how do you change culture? It's too big to change. Where do we start? How do we engage? There's no way to engage. So there's this intuitive understanding, culture speaking to itself through the movie, that there is a way to engage the Death Star. And the way you engage the Death Star is you score a direct hit on the Death Star. But a direct hit doesn't mean a direct frontal hit. It means there's a way to find your way through all of the defenses, which are all of the economic, governance, social, political, market forces, social forces of reality. That you can't take down. But there's a way to score a direct hit, which means there's a way to get in between, beneath, underneath, score a direct hit, and actually explode, stop in its tracks the culture of death, or shift that culture, change the culture, and move it in a completely different direction. That's a direct hit. A direct hit means how do we actually change the entire hyper-object of culture? We have a word in contemporary metamodern thought, hyper-object, this entire insanely complicated structure of the world, governance, economy, politics, social, etc. How do we change that? Well, there's a way to actually challenge existential risk and to actually undo it. That's this direct hit, getting underneath through all of the apparent structural obstacles and changing something in the very essence of the whole thing that's actually available, that you can actually access. Not easy to access, not simple. There's only a few small, tiny ships that go up against the Death Star to find their way in and to score that direct hit. That's culture intuitively speaking to itself. What does it mean to go up against a culture of death that has generated existential and catastrophic risk, and to be able to undo it, to change the course of this vector of evolutionary collapse, right? The very collapse of the present, the collapse of the present, right? The death of humanity as we know it, or humanity, period, and the collapse of the future. So in order to understand what this direct hit is, we need to understand what have been called appropriately the generator functions of existential risk. It's what actually causes existential and catastrophic risk, but it's a generator function, right? It generates, right, the entire system. And what we want to do for a second is look beneath the headlines, right, beneath the short-termism, and look structurally what's causing existential risk. We've looked at this issue for many, many years, and we've understood, together with a very small band of colleagues doing independent research around the world, that when you cut through all of the noise and you get to the signal, there's actually two primary generator functions for existential risk. The first is what we might call rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics. Or another name for that is what I called several years ago, Success 2.0. Success 1.0 is how success was understood in traditional society. Obedience to the traditional creator God who's outside of the world, who's created a set of rules that you must obey. Success 2.0 comes to the fore when modernity, we move from the pre-modern to the modern, and in modernity, which brought many goods and much dignity, but also brought with it a desiccated and degraded notion of what the human being actually was. The human being is of value in the modern world, and its deepest structures of thought and its major plot lines. The human being's value was based on their ability to self-commodify. And you self-commodify by being in not just competition, competition's healthy and beautiful, but in a kind of zero-sum competition. You either win or die. You're either in the ability of those who can self-commodify and succeed and rise, or your particular set of talents, right, don't actually match that. You can't quite rise. You're born in the wrong place. You're born in the wrong socioeconomic situation. You're born in a degraded family structure. And try as you might, and as much as you can transform, you can't actually get out of, right, the horrifying trap into which you were born. And so you actually can't rise. So, for example, there are 2 billion people in the world who don't have access to drinking water, not because they didn't pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but because we've generated a world in which the orienting story, which defines how we distribute resources and defines how we relate to each other, the basic story is a success story, and the plot line of that success story is rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. So the entire world, between companies, between divisions within a company, between people, between nations, between different regions, between different religions, right? It's always the same essential story which governs billions and billions of interactions. Interactions at their core are not rooted in value, right, in the sense of intrinsic value, the good, the true, the beautiful. They're rooted in my capacity to win, to succeed in rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. That structure drives everything. It's the invisible source code. It's the simple set of principles, broken principles, that actually drive reality. So the entire complicated system is driven by this broken principle, which is, am I successful? Successful has a very particular set of exterior connotations. I've got to self-commodify to be successful. It's always I against you, we against we. We forge temporary alliances, right, of some sort of vague interaction in order to mutually benefit us. But if it doesn't mutually benefit it, we break those. Now, what that creates is a situation of a tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons means we extract from the commons that which it took all of history to create. We ignore the future generations. We bankrupt the commons and rob the future of its birthright, meaning its very right to be born, because we're engaged in an extractive set of self-terminating technologies within an economic structure and a financial structure that will explode. And it'll explode because of bioweapons, it'll explode because of dead zones in the ocean, it'll explode because of various forms of gradual, over 3 or 4 decades, systems collapse, in which the very structures of economies, right, based on fractional reserve banking, right, based on an entire set of principles that govern linear material economies, will break down, right, will collapse. So that structure, underneath everything, rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics, that story that governs reality is the first generator function of existential risk. The second generator function, generated directly by the first, is complicated and not complex systems. Complicated means vast systems in which the parts don't know each other or are alienated from each other. Either they're alienated because people are in rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, or what's happening in one part of the world generates a ripple effect in a different part of the world, but those two parts don't know each other at all. So for example, a financial instrument created in 2008, perhaps in a particular company, can then be sold into Europe and then sold back to the United States and have a trickle-down effect which causes a financial meltdown and a mortgage collapse, which causes millions of lives to be destroyed. Very small example, bare small example. Or we can have a pandemic. And in this pandemic, right, we've got this vast, complicated system, but we don't have anything that creates connection between the parts of the system. So the system doesn't know how to talk to itself and to its different parts. And so in huge parts of the world, right, millions of people die of the pandemic who shouldn't die because there are actually available resources, but we actually don't know how to create them, how to distribute them, right, how to deploy them. And the last pandemic we saw, right, in 2019, 2020, was literally but a flutter, but a dress rehearsal, right, for catastrophic and existential risk to come imminently. Whether imminently means 20 years, 10 years, or 30 years, or 40, or 70, that's besides the point. It was a dress rehearsal. And that dress rehearsal stopped jet planes, kept everyone locked in their homes, caused hundreds of millions of people to lose their jobs, millions of people to die, up-leveled poverty unimaginably, reversed growths in fighting certain forms of disease and certain forms of hunger, right, and certain forms of gains in education, set them back decades. All of that happened because complicated systems that don't know each other, different parts of the systems don't know how to act in unison, in accord with each other. What does that mean? Two generator functions for existential risk beneath the headlines, beneath all of the printed words. One, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. Two, complicated and not complex systems. By complicated, think of the world economy as I just described it. By complex systems, if you want to think about a complex system, think about, let's say, a Brazilian rainforest. That's an example that systems theorists give when they distinguish between complicated and complex systems. A Brazilian rainforest, there's all these different parts, but all the parts can feel each other. They're allured to each other. Within a complicated system, there's no allurement between the parts. Within a complex system, there's deep allurement between the parts. The parts, in some sense, feel the whole. There's a sense in each part of having a larger relationship to the whole. Each part is omni-considerate of the whole. Each part expresses the whole, is in relationship to the whole. When there's waste, the waste is taken care of. When there's injury, the injury regenerates itself. Brazilian rainforest, not a complicated system, but a complex system in which there's allurement between the parts. We've now begun to understand the last 4 or 5 years that actually it's deeper. And this is where it gets wildly hopeful and wildly important. So stay close. Let's get on the edge of our seats and let's find each other now. You see, underlying these two generator functions for existential risk, there's actually a deeper root cause. The root cause that underlies even the generator functions of existential risk is what we've now identified as the global intimacy disorder. And the global intimacy disorder defines both rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, meaning I can't really be intimate with you. I can't have genuine love between us because there's always a hidden rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. And the intimacy disorder means also that the different parts in the complicated or fragile system are not intimate with each other. They don't know each other. They can't actually be in relationship to each other because they're dissociated, they're alienated from each other, which generates the fragile system, which breaks down, which systemically breaks down. But that's just the beginning of it. When you actually realize that both generator functions of existential risk are in fact sourced in a deeper root cause, this global intimacy disorder, you realize the following, and this is where hope is born, that the way to actually heal, the way to address, the way to effectively respond to the threat of dystopia and of existential risk is to actually heal, to transform the global intimacy disorder. If we can actually generate, right, a new order of intimacy, if we can actually evolve intimacy and create something that never existed before, right, a new global intimacy, then we can actually address both existential and catastrophic risk. And that's wildly optimistic, but accurate. You see, it's only when I can do diagnosis, it's only when I can identify the root cause that underlies even the generator functions that I actually birth hope. So the global intimacy disorder is actually rooted in something even deeper. We have to take our diagnosis one step deeper, our diagnosis of culture, which we need in order to heal culture, one step deeper. What is the root of a global intimacy disorder itself? And the root of a global intimacy disorder is a breakdown in a shared story of value. It's only a shared story, let's say between a couple, in an organization, in a tribe, right? In any form of society, on a team. It's a shared story that actually generates intimacy. And the story is a story of shared value. If there's no shared story of value that's felt to be real by everyone, it's intrinsic value, it's real value. If there's no shared story of value rooted in a set of what we might call first principles and first values that actually governs, that animates the relationship between the parts, between the people and the parts, then the system breaks down. The global intimacy disorder, which is the root cause for both generator functions of existential risk, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which itself generates the second generator function, fragile systems, complicated, not complex systems, are both rooted in the breakdown of a shared story of value rooted in first principles and first values. When there's no shared language, we can't talk to each other. When there's no shared grammar of value, we can't construct sentences and paragraphs, let alone policy together. It's only, right, a shared story of value rooted in what we hold together to be intrinsic, real first principles and first values that actually generates intimacy. That is a cause for enormous hope. Because what it means is that if we actually have the capacity, right, to generate a shared story of value, that shared story of value then births a global intimacy. Why is global intimacy so critical? Why is global intimacy rooted in a shared story of value so critical? Because each one of our challenges is global. Every challenge of existential risk, from the emergence of a destructive artificial intelligence to dead zones in the oceans, right, to the widening gap between have and have-nots that can actually generate a caste system in the world, which would make the caste system in India seem like the best of liberal society, in which a very tiny segment of society, and again, if you think science fiction, think the movie Hunger Games in the second decade of the 20th century, a very, very tiny fraction of society has access to technological augmentations. They can actually augment their body. Right? They can augment, improve, enhance their cognitive capacity. They can improve their aesthetic pleasability. They can create longevity. Right? They can create access, right, to ranges of possibilities that the rest of society, right, 99.9% has no access to at all. In other words, actually, in this technological moment, for the first time in history, that 0.1% is actually not just more wealthy, but the more wealthy are actually smarter, more cognitively enhanced, more aesthetically beautiful, live, right, much, much longer. They actually become literally a new race. There's actually a caste system at the very heart, right, of society itself. You have the environmental collapse structures, you have the currency reserve collapse issues, you have bio-warfare, right, biotech weapons, right, you have weaponized technologies distributed by rogue non-state actors available through drones, no longer an atom bomb that needs to be developed by a state, which is quite hard to do, which needs uranium and particular processes of enrichment, which can be monitored. You actually have rogue non-state actors that can get access to, right, technologies that are wildly destructive. You have engineered pandemics, the list goes on. All of those take place in a context of there being no shared story of value. The only story governing is rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics, which generate, therefore, fragile systems that break down. It's only by generating a shared story of value, governed by first principles and first values, a universal grammar of value, that we generate global intimacy. And global intimacy allows us to respond to global challenges. Each challenge that I just mentioned in that list is a global challenge. You can't respond to a global challenge without global coordination. But you only have coordination if you're living in a shared story. You have shared ordinating values. You can't have global coordination unless you have global coherence. There's no global coherence without a shared story of value. You can't have global coherence without global resonance. There's no resonance between us without a shared story of value. So without global coordination, you have no global coherence, and you have no global resonance. And if no global resonance, you can't take effective global action in response to existential and catastrophic risk. So it's only by generating a shared story of value rooted in first principles and first values that we actually generate a new intimacy. An intimacy with ourselves, an intimacy with reality, and also an intimacy with the future. We can actually generate a new culture that actually feels the future, that feels and hears the voices of the unborn, because our intimacy extends beyond our egocentric self. We can actually feel beyond ourselves, and we can actually feel into the future. It's only a new order of intimacy, what we might call an evolutionary intimacy, right? A global evolutionary intimacy that has the capacity to respond to existential and catastrophic risk. See, that's the direct hit. The direct hit is not to take on directly the economic systems, the social systems, the governance systems, right? The market structures. Those are all important, and there's important moves to be made in terms of governance, what's called social structure. So for example, suggestions have been made of having a long-term global council. It's a good idea because all of our problems are long-term and we have little short-term governments, and short-term governments are perfect examples of rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. And it's you have long-term global problems, and yet you have individual nations that are arrayed against each other in the garnering of resources, and then within that particular nation, right, the country is split into parts that are arrayed against each other in garnering resources, and whichever party wins in the rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics is elected. The other party is completely disempowered and therefore becomes bitter. They take control for a very short amount of time. In that short amount of time, their goal is to maintain power. People from the future don't vote. They don't have a say. So they play to their very narrow sector, their base that gets them elected again, and disempower all the people who are not in their system. That's rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, and it works within every country, all the countries against each other, within every company, within every system. So the direct hit is, can we actually tell a new story? Why is a shared story of value a direct hit? Because we all live inside of a story. We live in inescapable frameworks. So for example, the world today lives inside of a success story. We live and respond to the cues of that success story, that rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. And that governs billions and billions and trillions of actions and interactions of companies, businesses, politics, governance, distribution of resources. That's how it happens. And even when there's a crisis, you can't find your way out of it. So even in a pandemic in which you have a virus that clearly violates national boundaries, pandemics don't stay in one particular country, you can't actually create global coordination because there's no global coherence, because there's no global resonance, because there's no shared story. Because everyone's living inside of that success story for that country or for that region, and they have to defend their particular expression in the win-lose metrics. They have to defend their particular place, and the self-understanding is it's us against you. It's me against you. It's us against them. And so that's how resources are distributed, and that's how people die, and that's how breakdown happens, and that's how catastrophic risk happens, and ultimately that's the direct recipe for existential risk. When you change the story, you've evolved the source code. What would happen if everyone lived inside of a different story of value? And we're going to tell that story of value now in this conversation. But it's the story of value that I live inside that generates the billions and billions of actions, interactions, policies, governance, economics, social relations that take place. That's the invisible source code of the system. So when you evolve the source code, which means you evolve the story that people are living in, that is the playground of heart and mind, the invisible, inescapable framework, which generates all of our decisions and all of our actions, then you've scored a direct hit. Then you've changed the entire system. Then you've changed the vector of the future itself. Change the story, evolve the story, and you've generated hope, the memory of a new future. The inherent movement of evolution is a movement towards more and more life. In evolutionary psychology, which has made important contributions, but which is often also paper thin, whenever some great movement takes place in evolution, particularly within humanity, it's reduced to a survival drive. That's just a survival drive. But survival means life. That's the deeper understanding that the leading edges of science understands. Reality is moving towards more and more life. towards more and more value. And in that movement towards more and more life, which is value, because more and more life means more and more value, in that movement, there's crises. And crisis means there's a crisis of life. And a crisis of life means life is not getting along. The parts are not getting along with each other. They're alienated from each other. There's a crisis of relationship or a crisis of intimacy. And a crisis of intimacy takes place when the parts don't relate to each other in a way which generates new wholeness. That's how evolution works. That's the actual story of reality. It's a grand and gorgeous and stunningly beautiful storyline of reality. Reality seeks to bring separate parts together into larger wholeness. When that doesn't happen, there's a crisis. It's a crisis of intimacy itself. Let me give you an example. There's what particular scientific historians call the oxygen crisis. And the oxygen crisis takes place when single-celled prokaryotes, single-celled organisms, are unable to breathe. They're actually being destroyed by oxygen. And what they need to do is develop a new relationship to reality, to the different dimensions, chemical, elemental structures of reality, and they evolve. A new intimacy emerges, and single-celled prokaryotes become multicellular life. Different individual cells join together to create a new relationship between separate parts, a new whole called multicellular life, from which then emerges all the next steps in the evolution of life all the way to humanity. Crisis is a crisis always of intimacy. Intimacy always means relationship between the parts. And to really get this, we really need to understand that the actual plot line of evolution is not just what exterior science calls correctly, accurately, the movement from simplicity to complexity, but actually more and more complexity means more and more intimacy, more and more coherence between the parts. Evolution actually at its core is the evolution of intimacy. That's the deepest understanding at the leading edges of the sciences today. Evolution is the progressive deepening of intimacies. And in that sense, evolution is a love story. Evolution is the love story of the universe, not a Pollyannish love story, not a love story without agony and ecstasy, not a love story without multiple dimensions, but ultimately a story which is about the evolution of intimacy itself. Now, to get that, I need to understand what intimacy is. And so we formulated an equation in the interior sciences which applies all the way across all vectors of reality: matter, life, mind, and all the vectors of mind or of culture. It's an intimacy formula which governs a couple, an organization, economic systems, social systems, relationships to self, subatomic particles. They're all governed by this basic principle of the interior sciences, which we call the intimacy equation. And by understanding the intimacy formula, we'll understand what we mean, A, that all of evolution is the progressive deepening of intimacies, number one. Two, that every crisis is a crisis of intimacy. And three, that we resolve a crisis of intimacy by generating a new structure of intimacy. And then four, we'll then understand why the global intimacy disorder today is only resolved by the generation of a new and higher order of intimacy. We then understand that we're actually part of the evolutionary process and that we're actually engaged in a crisis. This is a meta-crisis, existential risk, and therefore it requires a meta-response, which means a new emergent, right? A new leap, a momentous leap and a new possibility of intimacy. But that's actually resonant with, it's actually part of the natural vector of evolution itself. This is the intimacy equation, which we've spent so many years researching. And it's an equation of what we call the interior sciences, but it governs interiors and exteriors, all of reality, all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. Whether you're talking about a couple or your relationship to yourself, you're talking about an organization, relationships between nations, relationships between economic entities, all relationships within subatomic particles, molecular structures, cellular structures, organismic structures, all relationships, all of reality is governed by this equation. Now, that is beyond exciting. That's a Darwin, Freud level, new physics level realization. You begin to understand that reality is governed by an inherent plot line, not by an alienated creator who's outside of reality, nor by a merely random cosmos, but by an inherent self-actualizing, self-organizing cosmos that self-actualizes, that self-organizes to ever greater expressions of value, of goodness, truth, and beauty, or said differently, of intimacy. Intimacy, wholeness as a value. So let's actually understand this intimacy equation. Intimacy equals shared identity. That's the beginning of the equation. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness. So there's shared identity, but otherness doesn't disappear. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness, and it's relative otherness. So relative is in brackets in the equations. It's relative, it's not absolute otherness. There's an underlying shared field. So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness, in the context of relative otherness, times mutuality of recognition, shared recognition, times mutuality of pathos, shared feeling. So we recognize each other, we feel each other, times mutuality of value, there's shared value between us, times mutuality of purpose, we have shared purpose. Let's just take a look at it. Let's look at it in a couple. Let's look at it in yourself. Let's look at it in a subatomic particle, just to get a sense of it. Subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, electrons. They come together, they're drawn together by the inherent allurement that drives cosmos. That's evolution, the love story of the universe. Evolution is driven towards deeper and deeper intimacies. Reality is allured towards ever deeper, wider intimacies. What the great mathematician who co-authored Principia Mathematica with George Bertrand Russell at Cambridge, Alfred North Whitehead, called the appetite of the cosmos. Cosmos is allured towards more intimacy. Intimacy means separate parts coming together in larger wholes, but let's be more formal. Intimacy equals shared identity. In the context of otherness, protons, neutrons, and electrons come together to form an atom. And yet there's a context of otherness. They remain protons, neutrons, and electrons. We know scientifically that protons, neutrons, and electrons recognize each other. There's a mutuality of recognition. That mutuality of recognition is amplified times a mutuality of pathos. The protons, neutrons, and electrons feel each other, quite literally. There's a shared field of code or meaning or value or information between the protons, neutrons, and electrons. And finally, they have a mutuality of purpose. They have a shared function. They're an atom. So that intimacy formula governs subatomic particles, but self-evidently governs a couple. The two people in a couple, whether it's a friendship or a business partnership or a marriage or a brother and a sister or two nations, whatever the form of couplehood is, they come together, and it's no longer just you and me. A genuine friendship, for example, or a marriage means we now have a shared identity. We're separate parts, but we're not just knowing each other in a kind of abstract or dissociated or alienated way. We have shared identity. In the context of otherness, we're not disappearing. It's not fusion. It's union. It's shared identity in the context of otherness. We recognize each other. There's a deep recognition between us, and there's a shared pathos, a mutuality of feeling. We can feel each other. There's a shared value. A couplehood requires a shared value. We live in this shared vision and system and mutuality of value. And finally, together we have mutuality of purpose. We're going somewhere together. Look at an organization, a nation, a tribe. Again, separate parts come together. They don't lose their distinction. If they lose their distinction, then it's not intimacy, it's totalitarianism. It's closed society. Right? It's a superimposed structure from above that crushes intimacy. But in an open society, we actually are governed by the intimacy equation. We come together as separate parts to form a larger whole. That larger whole, we have a shared identity. We're part of the same organization, part of the same tribe, part of the same company. In the context of otherness, we don't disappear. Our individuation is not obliterated. We have mutuality of recognition. We recognize each other. The parts can feel each other. In a real company that has a genuine corporate culture of intimacy and wholeness, the different divisions actually feel each other. They recognize each other. They actually have a shared value. They don't sub-optimize against the system. They all optimize together for the whole. Each division is omni-considerate for the sake of the whole, which then generates the capacity to effectively enact a shared purpose. That's intimacy. We could apply this molecularly, we could apply it economically, we could apply it politically, but what you begin to see is that the same intimacy equation applies all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. We just applied it in a moment, shockingly, to subatomic particles, to couples of every kind, and to organizations and tribes. Let me just do one last application to yourself. Intimacy with self works in precisely the same way. I'm made up of different parts. When one part of me sub-optimizes the system and optimizes itself, we get mental illness. When all of my parts, all of my voices are talking to each other, they're part of the same shared story, they're part of the same shared identity. When I haven't split off or dissociated from parts of myself, I begin to have wholeness, intimacy. Intimacy equals shared identity with all of my parts, with all of my voices. In the context of otherness, I need to give each voice its dignity, its place, times mutuality of recognition. The voices are in dialogue with each other. That there's a genuine interaction between the internal system of voices that live in me. They feel each other, mutuality of pathos. There's a shared underlying value in which they're all supporting the emergence of myself, which enacts the potential for a wildly effective and beautiful life, mutuality of purpose. That applies all the way up and all the way down. That's also precisely what a new story of value is. A new story of value is itself a new emergent of intimacy. Because what's a new story of value? Rooted in first values and first principles. It's the bringing together of the leading edge validated insights across all wisdom streams from pre-modernity, the traditional period, from modernity in all of its sciences and psychologies and evolutionary theories, from post-modernity with all of its important historical and contextual insights. We weave all of those parts together into a new whole greater than the sum of the parts. That's called synergy. We synergize between the different parts and we generate a new emergence, meaning a new intimacy, right? A new intimate coherence. That's a new story. What a new story means is we actually honor all the different parts. We don't mock religion. We don't say, oh, the end of faith, faith is terrible. We don't caricature huge swaths of humanity as being evil. Whether it's liberals caricaturing conservatives or conservatives caricaturing liberals or any of the other dismissals of other that dominate mainstream thinking in most societies, open and closed, and often liberal thinking at its best. Liberal thinking is self-involved with its own particular vision. And so, for example, its thoughts about religion are damning in the extreme. It characters religion and throws it out. That's not going to get us home. That's not going to respond to existential risk and catastrophic risk. We need a new story of value, which is a new emergent of intimacy. A new emergent of intimacy means a shared identity between the parts that generates a new wholeness. Here, we add a critical and key dimension in science, both exterior sciences and interior sciences. In the mid-20th century, systems theory emerges, the relationship between parts that live in a larger system. I no longer study and just dive down into an individual part and view it as fundamentally dissociated from the rest of the system. I begin to think in terms of systems. Then, in the 70s, computers allow for new forms of mathematics that generate complexity theory. And then complexity theory generates another expression called chaos theory. And at the core of complexity theory is mathematics that map extraordinarily complex, vast systems. In trying to understand how vast systems actually cohere, how there's a shared identity between all the parts, systems theorists and complexity theorists and chaos theorists at the leading edge referred back to a critical essay written by Alan Turing, the great code cracker in World War II, who was a brilliant scientist. The early computers were called Turing machines. And Turing, after World War II, working at Bell Lab, writes a seminal essay called Morphogenesis. And that essay was both read and unread, understood and not understood. And gradually over the decades, its full implications, at least to some in the leading edge, became more and more clear. And what Turing really understands is that which generates coherence, or what we're going to call intimacy, shared identity between vast systems of separate parts, is actually simple first rules. When you exponentially repeat simple first rules, that generates in the system a coherence between all the parts that get wider and wider and deeper until there's this dazzling, unimaginable breadth of complexity. But there's actually some allurement between those parts because they're all governed by these basic first principles. It's when I looked at morphogenesis that together with my colleagues, I began to understand the need to respond to existential risk through generating a new story of value rooted in simple first principles and first values. Because just like in the world of exteriors, simple first principles, simple first rules generate this unimaginable complex system, in the world of interiors, meaning not just in the world of exteriors, the world of matter and life, but in the world of interiors, which includes life, there's some level of interiority, even many would argue in matter, but there's certainly enormously deeper levels of interiority in the human world, which is why human beings, for example, build hospitals for the vulnerable at their best. In the interior human world, the way to organize vast billions and billions of human beings, right, who are operating based on broken first principles is to actually evolve those first principles. If you generate a new system of first principles and first values that are actually intrinsic to reality itself, and you actually cohere them in a new story of value, then you displace the success story. The success story rooted in zero-sum competition, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, which results in 2 billion people not having drinking water and a massive disadvantaging of those who don't start, right, at an even place in the playing field with a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny elite minority. You actually create a genuine equality of opportunity, not an equality of outcome, but an equality of opportunity. You level the playing field. You allow for human entrepreneurship and creativity, right, to find its way. You don't reduce people, right, to commodities. You actually generate a new flourishing. But how do you do that? You do that by telling a new story of value rooted in simple first principles and first values. So that's shocking. It's exciting. It means a direct hit. That's the direct hit on the Death Star. The direct hit, rooted in complexity theory, which we're now applying not just to exteriors but to interiors, is to actually generate a new story of value rooted in first principles and first values. Simple first principles and first values respond to the simplest questions. And the simplest questions are, where? Who? What? Where am I? What kind of universe do I live in? What's the nature of the universe I live in? Einstein got a lot of things right in physics and a lot of things wrong outside of physics. But there was an intuitive moment where he was asked by a reporter, what's the most important question? And he responds, is it a friendly universe? It's not quite, is it a friendly universe? But he had an intuition. And the intuition was profound and correct. Is there a welcome sign in the universe? Is the universe merely random? Or is there a context? Is there a directionality? Not an imposed directionality by an alienated, caricatured God. The God we don't believe in doesn't exist, right? Meaning the God that you've rejected because it's some caricature that violates science doesn't exist. But is there a set of inherent first principles and first values that are the very plot lines of reality itself? That would constitute a welcome home sign in the universe. It's the simple first principles and first values that are the plot lines of reality that live in us even as we live in the universe. We live in an intimate universe governed by these first principles and first values, but yet literally in our bodies, these first principles and first values live. We live in the intimate universe, but scientifically, the intimate universe quite literally lives in us. So the same vectors, the same plot lines that drive the intimate universe at every level of the evolutionary chain drive us. So when we ask the question, 3 simple questions, simple first principles and first values. Who? Where? What? Where do we live? Is the universe friendly? Is the universe intimate? Is there a welcome home sign in the universe? Is the universe a story? Is it going somewhere? Or is it merely a tale told by an idiot full of sounds and furies signifying nothing? And this, of course, is not a religion versus science question at all. It has nothing to do with that. We have to, of course, reject the dogmatic caricatures of religion that view reality as empty of its own inherent scientific principles and run by a puppeteer, alienated God, even as we reject, right, the dogmatic principles of not science, but scientism that insists that reality is chance, random, and that there's no value, and that love is not real, and that Eros isn't real, and that meaning is not real. Those are equally fundamentalist dogmas that both need to be rejected by any serious empirical thinker, meaning a thinker who takes account, as William James said, of all the evidence. We need to articulate a new set of simple first principles and first values, which are responses to these simple questions. So that's the where question. Where do I live? The second question is, who am I? And who am I has been a second key focus of our work. Who am I? What's my nature? And finally, what? And what means, what's there to do? What should be done? What's there for me to do? And what, of course, is rooted in two sub-questions, which are, what do I want? Or what do I desire? And what do I need? What are my deepest needs? And when I say deepest needs, what we imply is a distinction noted by all the wisdom traditions. I need to distinguish between my surface need and my deepest authentic need, just like I need to distinguish between my surface want or my surface desire and what we might call my deepest heart's desire. Those are not the same. So those are the what questions. Now, stay close for a second. If I really understand that just like I live in the intimate universe lives in me, and that the same impulses that drive all of reality in their more evolved forms drive me, I understand that my desire itself is the desire of evolution, not my surface desire, not my lowest common denominator manipulated desire, not my unrefined desire, but actually my deepest heart's desire. My deepest heart's desire is actually the desire of reality itself. And here we're already beginning to hint at an answer to the question of, who am I? The answer to those three questions, where am I? Who am I? And what's there to be done? Those generate the simple first principles and first values, which are the very vectors of the evolutionary story, the very plot lines of the amorous cosmos, the very plot lines of the intimate universe, the very plot lines of the cosmorotic universe, the very plot lines of the universe itself that live in me, as me, and through me. Let's start with who am I? Because from who am I, we'll actually be able to flow and understand where am I and what's there to do. And this is the core of our work at the Unique Self Institute in articulating a memory of the new human and the new humanity that's already emergent, nascent in us. Who am I? Who are you? You are an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence, love beauty, and love allurement, love desire of all that is, that lives in you, as you, and through you, that never was, is, or will be ever again other than through you. And as such, you have an irreducibly unique perspective. You incarnate an irreducibly unique quality of intimacy that together foster your unique gift. And your unique gift has the capacity to address a unique need in your unique circle of intimacy and influence that can be addressed in some unique way by you and you alone, that is yours and yours alone to do. Wow. To be a unique self means that you have a unique way of being. You have a unique song. You have a unique song to sing, a unique poem to write, a unique way of loving, laughing, living, being, and becoming in reality that never was, is, or will be ever again You're an irreducibly unique expression of the field of reality. You're not merely a separate self. You're not merely a skin-encapsulated ego, lost in rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. Albert Einstein was not wrong when he said that separateness is an optical delusion of consciousness. And his student David Bohm was reaching towards that realization when he talked about wholeness being a fundamental property of reality. I'm inseparable from the larger field of physical existence. I'm reliant on the plankton in the ocean, the fish in the sea, the soil. It's all part of my very core identity. But deeper than that, I'm connected to the entire field of desire, the entire field of cosmos's appetites. I'm connected to the field of value. I'm connected to the field of consciousness. There's a field of consciousness, a field of desire, right? A field of value from which I'm inseparable. There's what the interior science has called the seamless code of the universe. But that seamless code of the universe is seamless. It's not featureless. I am an irreducibly unique feature of the seamless code of the universe. And my very story is not something to move beyond. I might move beyond my surface story, my grasping story, my egoic story, but there's an essential thread, there's a plot line to my life, which matters. Because, let's get to the question of where are you? Reality is not merely a fact. It is a fact, of course, it's a scientific fact, but reality is also scientifically a story. In reality, if you look at the leading edge validated insights of the sciences, interior and exterior, reality is not merely an ordinary story, reality is a love story, but not an ordinary love story, it's an evolutionary love story. It's evolutionary love, or Eros, that animates the four forces of reality. Reality is driven by, animated by allurement. Allurement itself drives, animates all of reality. And your unique self, is your unique set of allurements. And you begin to have an understanding of who you are. You are irreplaceable. Depression is replaceability. You're irreplaceable. Let's play it again, Sam, as Woody Allen said when I was a kid in one of those early movies. Who are you? The answer to the question of who. You're an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence. Why is there love intelligence? Because reality is animated by Eros. It's self-actualized through simple first values and first principles, and the basic first value and first principle is Eros, and Eros is simply the experience of radical aliveness in which separate parts come together to form larger wholes or new intimacies. Reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies. Let's say it again. Simple. It's so simple. It's so elegant. It's so beautiful. It operates all the way up and all the way down reality. Who are you? You are, I am, you are an irreducibly unique expression of the love intelligence and love beauty and love desire. That is the initiating and animating energy and Eros of all that is, that lives in you, as you, and through you, that never was, is, or will be ever again other than through you. And as such, you have an irreducibly unique perspective and an irreducibly unique quality of intimacy that come together to foster your unique gift, and your unique gift addresses a unique need in your unique circle of intimacy and influence that can be addressed by no one that ever was, is, or will be ever again other than you. And as such, you are uniquely poised at the edge of darkness to actually proclaim through your own individuation, let there be light. No, you're not alone in this, because actually unique selves join hands with other unique selves, and they create unique self symphonies. Reality self-organizes through uniqueness at all of its levels. And at the human level, unconscious uniqueness becomes conscious uniqueness. Human beings now have the capacity to awaken to a knowing of our true nature. I'm not just separate self, a skin-encapsulated ego, but I'm also not just what's called often in the interior sciences true self, one with the field of consciousness. No, I'm a unique self. I'm a unique expression of the field of consciousness, desire, and Eros that lives irreducibly uniquely in me, as me, and through me. And I am needed by all that is. The actual experience of being a unique self means that I actually have a direct experience through my own irreducible experience of uniqueness that I was intended by reality. Reality intended me. I didn't decide where to be born or to whom to be born or when to be born and with which qualities to be born, either DNA structured qualities or interior unique DNA qualities. I was intended by reality. I was clearly, self-evidently, through my uniqueness, chosen by reality. Uniqueness implies recognition. I'm unique, I'm distinct, I'm recognized by reality. I'm love adored by reality because love's not merely an emotion. Love at the human level is also a perception. It's also a perception all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. There's different levels of perception, but simply at the human level, I love you means I see you. Remember that early 21st century movie, Avatar, I see you. Love is a unique self-perception, right? I'm love adored by all of reality. But not only, reality is driven by Eros, and a quality of Eros is appetite, according to Alfred North Whitehead, or desire. So my very existence, my unique existence, unique configuration of reality that is me, means that I've been desired. I am desired. I'm sustained by that desire in every second. I'm desired by all of reality. And finally, I'm needed by all of reality. So those are what we call the 6 core unique self needs. And there's finally a 7th need. And it's the need for my own growth, my own transformation, my own emergence, my own deepening. That's a growth need. Within the vector of my unique self, I deepen, I continuously transform, and I realize I'm not separate from reality, but all of reality actually lives in me, as me, and through me. I live in the intimate universe. The intimate universe lives in me. We said at the onset that there were 2 risks. One was the death of humanity. The second was the death of our humanity. The death of humanity, existential risk, we said was generated by rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, a failed story of human identity. That story is then supplanted by a new emergent, and that emergent is unique self, right? And unique self symphonies, which become the self-organizing Eros and energy, the self-actualizing Eros and energy of the self-actualizing cosmos itself. That's how we generate a source code evolution that changes the billions and billions of social interactions happening all across the human world. Every economic interaction, every political interaction, every social interaction, every sexual interaction, every existential interaction, every emotional interaction, every intellectual interaction, it all changes. Because every action and interaction takes place within the context of the new story. When you shift the new story of value, then you change the vector of the entire story. That's why this new story of value, unique self and unique self symphonies, and it's a story that we've validated in deep research. We've begun to publish volumes. There's much more to come, right? To actually generate this new story of human identity rooted in the best of the interior in the exterior sciences. I could talk now for many hours about the irreducible uniqueness on a scientific level, the 100,000 DNA markers of uniqueness in every human being, just to begin, the atomic unique energy structure, the unique atomic signature of every human being, the unique cellular signature of every human being. But we'll leave that for a different conversation. Let's go to the next and the final key point. It's not just that the death of humanity, that existential risk, is addressed by this new story of value rooted in first principles and first values. It's that the second existential risk, the death of our humanity. And the death of our humanity means the emergence of a technocratically driven, think China, closed society that is a top-down imposition. That's, of course, precisely what will emerge if open societies can't cohere. If open societies are rooted in short-termism, governed by win-lose metrics, in other words, short-term presidents, short-term CEOs, short-term human beings that are all optimizing for short-term benefit that can't even see into the next decade, let alone see across the world, let alone see future generations, human beings who are non-intimate with a decade from now, non-intimate with other dimensions of humanity, and non-intimate with the future and non-intimate with the past, then we have the collapse, right? Rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics generates a self-terminating system, a global civilization that, because of its exponential power, right, creates exponential collapse, AKA the death of humanity. The alternative, the closed societies step in. Russia at its worst, not Russians, but Russia in its horrific form, right, governed by the likes of Putin, right, or China steps in, right, governed by the likes of its contemporary leadership. Instead of having the natural self-organizing wisdom and brilliance of the Russian people and the Chinese people participating in a unique self-symphony. In order to respond to Xi in China or Putin, both of whom are deeply versed in the literatures of today, which say that there is no shared story and that there is no intrinsic value. And so, of course, their only alternative is, for multiplicative of reasons, a closed society. But what if we were able to speak directly to the heart of the Russian genius and the heart of the Chinese genius, and together cohere and articulate a shared story of value, to begin to articulate a postmodern vision of value? Yes, the old vision of value as eternal and preordained is incorrect. Value evolves. There's a word that they call in the interior sciences the Tao. And the Tao is the intrinsic field of value. It's the best way to understand the Tao. It's the intrinsic fields of value. But we generally understand the Tao as being eternal in the sense of preordained and unchanging values. That's a mistaken value theory. Values are actually evolving. Eros love is real, but Eros evolves. So the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. And that evolving Tao integrates the best of East and West, the best of traditional, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern into a new story, which itself is a new configuration of intimacy. Intimacy means a new sense of shared identity between the parts. How wildly exciting this is. This is the direct hit. The capacity, which is the overwhelming moral imperative of this moment in time, responding to the two forms of existential risk, the death of humanity and the death of our humanity, both of which can be not only averted, but can actually be transcended into triumph. We're not just before a looming dystopia. We're actually poised between utopia and dystopia. And it's the telling of a new story of value, rooted in evolving first values and first principles, that can take us home, that can create not only a future, but a future of unimaginable depth, unimaginable goodness, unimaginable truth, unimaginable beauty. We are the only voice to speak for all of the present, to actually be in integrity with the past, which passed us the baton. And we are the only voice for the trillions of unborn whose cries pierce our hearts. Friends, we live at a time between worlds, at a time between stories. Story is not an accident in reality. Story is actually a first principle and first value of reality itself. Story means that there's a plot line. It's going somewhere. Story means that there's some dimension of freedom, much different than we think freedom to usually be. Freedom is much more nuanced and complex. But there's a freedom to actually express and live the unique allurements which are my deepest identity. And story means that there's value. We're allured to fulfilling ever deeper value within our own consciousness. Story is a first principle and first value of reality itself. And every story has plot lines. And the core plot line of the universe is love, is Eros, is ever greater value, ever greater depth, ever greater goodness, truth, and beauty, ever greater uniqueness. Now, I want to conclude perhaps with one critical point. We're not saying at the Unique Self Institute that there's no mystery. That'd be absurd. That would be dogma of the worst kind. There's an evolving story. That evolving story evolves within a plot line of value that's real. We don't answer questions, we respond to questions, and we keep asking them. And the evolution of value is the great plotline of reality itself. Reality is the story of the evolution of love, driven by evolutionary love itself. And our story as a people, our story as a global evolutionary family, our story as individuals, our story as families, our story as friends and beloveds, our chapter and verse, unique chapter and verses. What did the great poet write? There's a verse for each of us to contribute. That's the new story. That's the response to the meta-crisis, the crisis of intimacy, to which we respond by articulating a new vision and experience of intimacy, global intimacy with the fullness of ourselves, with the fullness of humanity, with the fullness of the life world, with the fullness of the planetary stack, the world of matter, with the fullness of past, the fullness of present, and the fullness of future. Let's do this together. We can. We will. We need to. We must.